The 2023 NFL Draft is just around the corner, and today on Sports Around the Bar, we're going to be ranking each and every guy in the most important position, the quarterback. I'm Jake, and today we're going to go through the top 12 guys that we see as draftable in this draft this year. So without further ado, if you haven't yet, grab a drink and let's get right into it. Let's start first at the top of our board, and then we'll work our way down. Sitting at number one, the obvious choice, and the reason he's so chalky and number one at the top of most people's boards is Bryce Young out of Alabama. Now, if this guy was 6'2", and he was 220 pounds, there wouldn't be a single person out there in the media that wouldn't be saying that he was the number one choice easily. Obviously, that's probably not the case when you consider that he's 5'10", and maybe 190 pounds when all's said and done. I know he weighed in 204 at the combine, but that's a load of crap. We all know that he was out there probably chugging milk and getting up on the scale beforehand. The guy probably drank like 3 gallons of milk and was standing out there with a beer belly and everything. So he did whatever it takes. There's a reason he didn't do any of those drills at the combine is because he put on a bunch of bad weight to, make it look like he's heavier than he is. The truth of the matter is he's probably going to play the game somewhere around 185 or 190 pounds. If he was bigger, he'd be the consensus number one pick. I don't think anyone would be questioning it. They'd be talking about this guy is as good as Trevor Lawrence was as a prospect coming out. Instead, what we've got is kind of a head scratcher where the best comparison we've seen has been to guys like Kyler Murray. I've heard a little bit of Russell Wilson. I've heard a little bit of Drew Brees. I think Kyler Murray is the closest in pure height, seeing as they're the exact same 5/10 and I think it's 1/8 inches tall. The difference is Kyler Murray is a much wider, much heavier guy at that weight than Bryce Young is. So the real question is, with durability, how far do you trust him? And the short answer and the long answer is when a guy has this talent, you just roll the dice. You're going to kind of notice this as we move through the rest of these rankings and these guys in this year's draft class. Everybody has something wrong with him. And if the main thing that you can take away from a guy's play style is that he's doing it at a size that we haven't seen, I think you just got to hold your nose and you got to take him because he is the best quarterback in this class. Pound for pound, when everyone's out there, he is the best guy. So what should you gamble on? You should gamble on that if I take him, I'm going to have a good offensive line, maybe one that needs to be a little bit shorter because of his height problems, but we're going to put the best offensive line in front of him, and we are going to maximize his ability to stay on the field by making sure he takes as few hits as possible. Is that going to happen with Carolina? Year one, they've been getting better, right? They've put a little bit of emphasis on their offensive line, so maybe it makes sense. I think it actually makes a lot more sense than Houston, who, except for Laramie Tunsil, hasn't really had a lot of great performances out of the rest of their offensive line. But regardless, if either one of those teams, whether it's C.J. Stroud that goes first, whether it's Will Levis, Hendon Hooker, Anthony Richardson, anyone else in this draft class, whoever goes first, I think if you're the Texans at 2, even with Bryce Young's height and your problems protecting the quarterback over the past couple of years, he's just good enough that the reward outweighs the risk. And you just got to hold your nose and say, we're going to take him. We're going to gamble on him staying healthy, and we're going to gamble on him being a top-level quarterback as long as we do our job and make sure we mitigate the risk and the number of hits that he takes. Now, second in my rankings, this is going to be a little bit controversial. I know a lot of people are kind of seeing him drop off in some of this pre-draft process. Is actually Will Levis out of Kentucky. Now, this guy, 6'3", 232 pounds, he is, kind of the prototypical quarterback for today's game. He's got great size, great weight. He's got great arm strength. He's an elite athlete in terms of running the ball, so there's no doubt that that's going to be part of his game. And what is most impressive to me is of these top quarterbacks that we're going to be talking about, of these top 5 to 6 guys, he is really the only one that faced not only top-level competition, but he did so without being on a super team. I mean, when we're talking about C.J. Stroud out of Ohio State, we're talking about Alabama's Bryce Young, Hendon Hooker in Tennessee, even Anthony Richardson in Florida, who is not as good as they have been in years past, but is still a mega program in college football. Will Levis didn't have any of that at Kentucky. Maybe arguably the best pro to come out of that offensive side of the ball over the past couple of years since Levis has been there has been Wan'Dale Robinson, who is a slot receiver at the NFL level. So he doesn't have the Marvin Harrison Jr.'s. He doesn't have the Jameson Williams that Bryce has had over the course of his career. He is missing those top-level weapons that everybody else has had. I mean, he didn't even really have any offensive linemen. I think the only guy who comes to mind is Darian Kennard, who was like a 5th-round pick last year. So when you look at Will Levis, I think the adversity of what he has faced and has still basically put Kentucky on the map as a football school, because up until this point, They haven't sniffed the top 10 in college football. 2 years ago, when he was the starter and they had their best year under him, they were, I think, ranked 9th for the first time in program history. So I think when you look at what Will Levis has, he has all of the traits and all of the attributes that you want to see out of a top prospect. His accuracy is good, if not quite elite. I wouldn't call him Drew Brees with his accuracy yet. So it's not a strength of his game, but I still think he's accurate enough that it's not going to be an issue. You're getting all the athletic testing that you'd want to see out of a guy this size. You're getting all of the plus athleticism, plus running ability, plus arm strength. He can do it all in terms of that. If he winds up with a good coach team, I think he's actually going to have one of the highest ceilings out of anybody in this draft. So when we're talking Will Levis, the sky is the limit. I think people have kind of soured on him in the same way that they soured on Justin Herbert a little bit, where they were expecting higher highs in that last year in college, and when they didn't materialize, people must just kind of assume that he's not a good quarterback. I think it's realistically because Kentucky was absolutely terrible, and he was playing through injury all of 2022. He had a turf toe injury, didn't slow him down, kept playing. I do think it impacted his performance a little bit, but more than anything, I think it's just Kentucky was a bad team. So I'm not going to hold that against him. He's my number 2 quarterback, and I think when you consider what he has faced and who he has faced compared to some of these other guys, you need to take the performance with a grain of salt and say that I believe that when all things equalize, he's been much more battle-tested than any of these other guys have been. Teams like Alabama, teams like Ohio State, even teams like Tennessee and Florida, there's a couple games every year where they actually have to face teams that are legitimately better rosters than they have. Kentucky, that was almost an every week thing in the SEC. Rolling in at number 3, C.J. Stroud out of Ohio State. A lot of people have him as the number 2 quarterback. I actually think he's going to go number 1 in the draft from what I've seen out of the Panthers. It feels like this is their guy. I like C.J. Stroud. I think he has a lot of the similar things that Will Levis has in terms of size, the arm strength that you want to see. His arm isn't as good as Will Levis's. His accuracy might be a little bit better, but I think one thing that sets these two guys apart and why I think there's actually a decent size gap between the first 2 quarterbacks and where C.J. Stroud is at is how perfect this offense was, and you still saw him come up short. The last thing people remember about C.J. Stroud was the Georgia game and how well he played in that game, and he did. It was a little bit of proof of concept, right? You got to see him against what was the best defense, maybe I think aside from the Georgia team the year before, this is one of the best defenses we've ever seen in college. So we got to see him do it against top-level competition, and he had a good game. The problem, and I think the main thing that this kind of erased, was that C.J. Stroud lost back-to-back years to Michigan, who, again, was a great defense, wasn't that good of an offense either one of these past couple of years. I know they've made the playoffs, and they've been kind of in and around, but they certainly aren't one of the best teams in football, at least in my opinion. They have a great defense. Their offense is somewhat lackluster, and C.J. Stroud lost both of those games by about 20 points. And I've seen some people kind of make some excuses for it and say, well, it's not on Stroud, and he played okay in that game. The fact that they still weren't getting over 25 points against a team like Michigan, I think that does come back to the quarterback a little bit. I think when you are considered to be one of the top guys and you're playing at a program like Ohio State that is just riddled with first-round wide receivers. Think Garrett Wilson last year. Think Chris Olave. This year he had Jackson Smith and Jigba, even though I think he was hurt for that game. But they had Marvin Harrison Jr. They have other guys that are just – this is the best wide receiver room in college football. And you're still putting up 20 points, that should scare, I think, a lot of teams, because when you take that and you have him jump to a team like, let's say he falls to Houston, and you have one of the worst rosters in the NFL, what kind of drop-off are we talking about there? We're talking about going from what is the best offense to what is arguably the worst offense in the NFL. The game is going to speed up. I think C.J. Stroud has a lot of problems, or at least has some limitations that we haven't seen addressed because of how good Ohio State is. He's not a runner, so how is he going to respond to having a bad offensive line in front of him? He's not a guy that necessarily handles pressure very well. I think he kind of folds a little bit. He has at times, again, you look at the Georgia game and you're like, I'm not worried about it at all. Every other game, pretty much, I don't know. I wasn't as blown away. Couple that with the fact that Ohio State has had a bunch of duds at quarterback, because I don't think their scheme and their system and the way they play football is very good for converting college quarterbacks to great pros right away. Over the past decade, who's the only Ohio State quarterback to really stick? Justin Fields right now, and there's still some question marks. We went into this draft period saying, is Chicago going to trade a guy like Justin Fields to bring in Bryce Young, to bring in one of these other starters? They ultimately pretty much have told us no by trading back to 9, but the thought was out there. Nobody is sold that Justin Fields is the guy yet. And I think a lot of that also comes from Ohio State instilling some bad sort of tendencies into their quarterbacks that have to be unlearned. I think Stroud's going to deal with a little bit of that too. I think he's going to be one of the slower starters in terms of the NFL this year because of that. All in all, there's been a lot of negative on C.J. Stroud. I still think he has a really high ceiling. I still think he's a guy that, even if the floor is a little bit lower, like I think Will Levis is probably a safer pick than him. I think Bryce Young, if he's healthy, is definitely a safer pick than him. I think C.J. Stroud still can be an elite quarterback at the NFL level. So even though there is a gap between those top two guys for me, he is still a guy that when you take him third off the board, or if you took him at number 2, or if you took him if it's the Colts at number 4, I think you're still really comfortable with the prospect that you're getting. You're still seeing this as an elite quarterback. And that's why for C.J. Stroud, I have a top 10 grade instead of a top 5. Realistically, he's going to go higher than that. He may even go number 1, but I don't think he slips out of the top 5. I think teams are going to covet his size and his accuracy and what he can do in the pocket. I think ultimately, though, when you're comparing him to the other two, he's just a step behind in terms of what everybody has been able to do with what they've been given. All right, 3 guys in. I'm already in on my second beer, so this is going real well. So we've gone from the top 3 guys in this draft class, 2 of which I saw as top 5 prospects, 1 of which I saw as a top 10, and then we're going to see a significant drop-off. And when I say a significant drop-off, I mean I don't know that I'd want to take any of these other guys in this draft class with a first-round pick. And the reason I say that, let's move on to our 4th guy and talk about Hendon Hooker coming out of Tennessee, because Hooker, for everything he did well in college, he had a bunch of accurate passes. He was great throwing a deep ball. The connection between him and Jalen Hyatt was absolutely fantastic. I think when you look at a guy like Hendon Hooker, there are so many red flags that if you put yourself in the mind space of a coach and you said, I have one chance realistically to take a quarterback, or I'm going to lose my job if I mess that pick up, are you going to take a guy like Hendon Hooker? Are you going to take one of these other guys on the list and bet your house and your career and everything on it? I don't think so. I think this is a scenario where if you don't get one of these top 3 guys, you probably are taking more of a project that maybe he develops into something, but I'm not going to go and gamble my entire franchise on taking this guy and say everything will work out. So I think it's really important for a lot of these teams, and I think this is where Arizona is holding one of the most important trades in the draft at pick 3, is to get one of these top 3 guys. Because after that, Hendon Hooker, again, a lot of positives. He's big enough. He's 6'4", 220. He's a guy that, again, great athlete running the ball. I think part of his drawback comes with the fear that he's more of injury prone. I watched a lot of Tennessee football this year, and it seems like he was always dealing with something, whether it was shoulders, whether it was hip, lower leg, a bunch of other things where it wasn't enough to keep him out of the game before he tore his ACL, but it was enough that you're starting to see a bit of decline, and it was a bit of an excuse as to why he was missing some plays and messing up on some things, missing some open receivers. When you're talking about Hendon Hooker, you're at a spot where I think an early second-round pick is where you want to spend to get a guy like this, because not only is he one of the oldest quarterbacks coming out of the draft this year, he is coming off a torn ACL, which means he's going to miss most of your preseason. He's going to miss a lot of your training camp. He's going to miss a lot of your rookie workouts and everything else. He's going to miss a lot of time that, again, is paramount, I think, for a guy to come in and be a year 1 starter. I don't really see him being a guy that, let's say he comes back for preseason, that you're going to just go through training camp and chuck him into an NFL offense, considering how different things were in Tennessee. I mean, this is just an offense that has basically no bearing on what you're going to do in the NFL. A lot of weird routes, a lot of lining receivers up outside of the 20s, outside of the hash marks, and really, well, of course they're outside the hash marks, but lining receivers up outside and finding ways to get those one-on-one, man-on-man matchups that you're just not going to see at the NFL level. So you're going to have to teach him a new scheme. You're going to have to teach him to play the game at the pro level. Everything's going to be speeding up, and he's going to be doing all of that coming off of injury. While I like him a lot as a prospect, and I like a lot of what he can do, he can run, he's very accurate with the ball, he doesn't make a ton of mistakes, and he's also really good at finding guys down the field. You're kind of just shoehorned into waiting a year, I think, with all of just the negatives going against him. He's a guy that I think you're best suited to take, park on the bench, and then not worry about until next season, because maybe it's someone like Detroit losing Jared Goff, or maybe the Seahawks take him as insurance to whether Geno Smith is actually the guy that we saw last year or not. I would like to see one of those teams probably make a move early in the second round to go out there and grab this guy instead of a team kind of gambling their future on him. I mean, I've seen some mock drafts that have him going in the top 5. I have some mock drafts seeing him all throughout the first round. And while I think he does have a little of that back-end first-round potential, all things equal, with the torn ACL, with everything else going on, I think you just have to pump the brakes on Hendon Hooker a little bit and say he is more of a let's wait and see guy. And when you have a guy that's let's wait and see at the most important position in the draft, you take him in the second round. You don't take him in the first. Now, at number 5, a guy that probably a lot of other people are a lot higher on than I am. Not probably. I've seen some people say he needs to be the number 1 quarterback. Anthony Richardson, the quarterback out of Florida. 6'4", 230 pounds. He's an elite athlete when it comes to running the ball. The problem is he just is not very accurate. You know, he had a 53% completion percentage in college. Those windows are only going to get tighter in the pros. And he is a guy that, again, it's just new to the position. He's really raw. He is only been a starter for realistically 1 year. And he is a guy that I know there's some people drawing Lamar comparisons with the way Lamar runs the ball, but I think Lamar was a much better passer coming out of college. I think Anthony Richardson is a guy that you're basically going to have to build from the ground up. And for everybody saying that the Panthers might take him at 1, or the Titans might trade up to 3, or one of these other teams are going to take him in the top 5, I don't think it's going to happen because the last 2 guys that we've seen with this similar skill set were Trey Lance and Malik Willis. And how has it panned out for them? I know it's not fair to judge Anthony Richardson by those other guys, but I think you're in that similar risk-reward territory that we talked about earlier, where if you get one quarterback to pick, are you going to take a guy with 53% completion percentage in college where the game is easier to throw, where everything is much more wide open and you should be having a much easier time? I don't see it. I don't see one of these teams that are desperately in need of a quarterback taking a guy like Anthony Richardson and saying, we will take the time that it's going to take to teach him to throw the ball, because a lot of times those teams wind up changing their coaches. You know, do you feel like Houston and Nick Caserio, their GM, is safe if he goes out and takes Anthony Richardson and he takes 2 years to get good? Probably not, right? Jim Irsay and Chris Ballard. Do you think Chris Ballard's safe long enough in Indianapolis to take Anthony Richardson and say, well, he's a 3-year project and we're hoping by year 3 we have Jalen Hurts? No, I really don't think so. So I think he's a guy that as the draft moves on, we're going to see a lot of speculation and a lot of controversy as to why he's dropping, but I think it's more because the media is higher on this guy because they see the positives, but you don't see the negatives that come with this thing, where with any of these picks, where most of these coaches need these guys to be good today. And if they're not good today, I'm going to be updating my resume and likely taking a big career step back. So for me, Anthony Richardson is a guy that you want to spend a second-round pick on. You want to take him, and you want to put him on the bench for a year or 2 and see if he develops into that passer. It worked out with Lamar Jackson. It worked out with Josh Allen, where both of those guys were high-end running athletes that were not great at throwing the football when they got into the league. I think Lamar was a much better passer than Anthony Richardson was, and while I don't think Josh Allen necessarily was, I think the thing that set Josh Allen apart was also going out and acquiring a number 1 wide receiver. So unless I had that on my roster already, and I said, Anthony Richardson can start day 1 because I have a guy like, let's say, DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe not anymore, but DeAndre Hopkins, where he can go out, he can dominate, and Richardson has that safety blanket that he can always look to. I don't think I'm spending a top pick on him. I really don't. I think he's a guy that drops because, not just because of his running ability, but because the last 2 guys that have leaned into that skill set have been Trey Lance and have been Malik Willis, and both of which to this point have been massively disappointing. So I think the media is talking him up. I think the media is kind of like driving this frenzy, kind of like they did with Malik Willis last year, and saying he was the number 1 quarterback off the board and he could go as high as number 2 and all the rest of it. And then ultimately he wound up being pick 100. I think Anthony Richardson is not going to fall that far because he's that good of a running athlete. I think Anthony Richardson is probably going to go somewhere in the back half of the first round to the first part of the second round, depending on where teams see him. So that was a lot of negative. Let's talk about the positive, because I don't want to just say I'm totally out on Anthony Richardson, but I think he's a guy that when you look at what he can do running the ball, if you put a great offensive line in front of him and you put a good running game, I think you can mimic the Lamar Jackson style offense out of Baltimore. It's just you have to wonder, is that going to be good enough? Is that going to be what I want to try to construct when you've seen Baltimore get to the playoffs and look really good doing it, but then Lamar's either had injuries going into it that have slowed him down and forced like Tyler Huntley to play, or they've been one and done a lot in the playoffs. I don't know that that's necessarily what I want to hang my hat on when I have the choice out of the 3 guys in front of him, especially when we're talking about Bryce Young, Will Levis, and CJ Stroud. But I don't know that I'd take him over Hendon Hooker. I really don't. I think Anthony Richardson is a guy that if I had a ready-made passer like Hendon Hooker that I think has the ability and has much more of a refined skill set throwing the ball already, I think I'd lean into that guy who's a good runner and a good passer instead of the guy that's just an elite runner and you're going to have to teach him to throw the ball at the NFL level. I never really got around to those positives. He is an elite athlete, and with his size and his running ability, he might be a game changer at quarterback, right? He could be a Josh Allen that is unstoppable running the football. And that's what I think a lot of teams are going to be banking on. But the question is, am I going to go out and give up my first-round pick, especially in the top 5? If I'm Indianapolis and I'm Chris Ballard, am I hanging my career on this? I guess we'll see on draft night. If it was me, I'd probably be going a different direction. 6th in the rankings, and we're going to start speeding up a little bit because this is the last guy that I really see as a starting candidate quarterback in this draft is Tanner McKee. This is a guy you want to spend in the late second round on because of just the projection. You know, he's 6'6", he's 230 pounds, he's got great accuracy, he's a great decision maker, and even though things were really bad at Stanford where he came from, he managed to kind of, make lemonade when he was handed lemons. So that's a guy that when you're in the back of the second round and you want to take a guy, not necessarily to start, but maybe he's a 2 or 3 year project that you throw him behind a Kirk Cousins, you throw him behind a Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay, you throw him behind one of these other kind of bridge quarterbacks and see if he develops. This is exactly where you want to take a guy like that. He has enough upside with his size and with his arm and with his accuracy that you'll take him, you'll park him, and theoretically, he develops into a starting level quarterback where you don't need to go out and spend a top pick on a guy like that. If he works out, fantastic. If he doesn't, well, it was our second round pick and we were just looking, right? You take him late enough that you don't have to worry about explaining it to your starting quarterback, and you throw him on the bench, and presumably, unless he's in a spot like Indianapolis somehow doesn't take a quarterback and they take him, or Tampa Bay with Baker Mayfield where they have a journeyman quarterback, maybe somehow San Fran gets their hands on him. Unless he's in one of those scenarios where they don't have a clear-cut starting quarterback, they have a guy that's more of a bridge, but you're not married to more than a year. I don't really see him being a day one starter. I think he's a guy that develops behind somebody. You sit him, he doesn't really have much of a chance to compete, and then, I don't know, maybe he's a Tennessee guy. Maybe the Titans draft him and they sit him behind Tannehill and he's the heir apparent after the fact. But he's a guy you take and then you see if he develops. And if you're talking about a second round pick, in terms of risk and reward, yeah, that could have been another player. It could have been a good player, especially in the second round. That's probably why I wouldn't spend pick 35 to 40 on him. But if you took him in the second round and you push him a little bit farther down and he's somewhere in the 50s, you could take that guy, and if you hit and you have a starting quarterback coming out of the second round that allows you to spend your first round pick on a receiver or an offensive lineman in this draft class to buff up your offense for him to step in, I think you're just farther ahead than you would be if you spent a high second round pick on him. He's not a sure enough thing that I can sit there and gamble on him. As far as upside goes, he's got the size, he's got the arm, he's got the accuracy. As far as downsides goes, I don't think he's particularly great under pressure. I don't think we saw a ton at Stanford that said that, for sure this guy is going to be a starter. He had trouble elevating a bad team, but that doesn't necessarily bother me too much. I think there is just a threshold where the team is too bad, and I think that's what he was facing. So Tanner McKee is one of those guys that if you spend a late second-round pick on him, you have a comfortable gamble on perhaps getting a top-level starter in the NFL or a guy that develops into a top-level starter if all things go well. And if it doesn't, well, how many teams throw away second-round picks on quarterbacks all the time? You don't really have to stress it too much. That's exactly where I see a guy like McKee going. Now we're getting into the weeds because these guys are not starting caliber guys. I don't really see them competing for starting jobs. I don't really see them battling. But at number 7, I have Max Duggan out of TCU, a guy that not a lot of people are very high on considering the year that TCU had. They made the playoffs. They won a bunch of improbable games. I see Max Duggan as a guy kind of like Gardner Minshew where he just has that gamer mentality. He has that never say die attitude where even if he doesn't have the physical traits that a lot of these other guys have, he has, I don't want to call it heart because that sounds like it's really reductive, but he has the heart to battle in some of these games. He's the perfect guy you want to take as your backup quarterback. He was really good in the clutch this year. He's made some big plays under pressure, and he's a guy that I see as kind of a fringe starter that maybe he winds up in the Gardner Minshew or Teddy Bridgewater role where teams bring him in. They say, maybe it's your team, or maybe if we don't get our guy, you can start this year. I don't really see the high end for him. But if you have a top-level backup, how often do quarterbacks miss a couple games and teams find themselves needing to rely on that backup? It happens. It happens in today's NFL, and I think it's always going to happen as long as the game is physical. So having a guy like Duggan, is where you want to spend an early fourth-round pick. You spend the pick on him, kind of like the Patriots did with Bailey Zappi last year, and said, this guy's enough of a gamer that maybe if he has to play 2 to 4 games for us this season, maybe we come out 2-2. Maybe we're 3-1. Maybe we're 1-3, but at the very least, we're competitive in those games, and our season just doesn't fall apart because our starting quarterback got hurt. You know, you look at teams, and I'm going to go back to my team, the Tennessee Titans. As soon as Ryan Tannehill went out, chalk them up. I mean, they battled. The defense was good, but realistically, the season was over. And a lot of teams, maybe more than half of them, are in a similar scenario. I think spending a fourth-round pick on a guy like Duggan can avoid some of that. And maybe it's not year one. Maybe it takes 2 or 3 years for him to reach that higher-level backup position. But I think he is a guy that is going to come in. He's going to work hard. He's going to be a team-oriented guy. And he is one that if disaster strikes and your quarterback goes down, you're in a better place than most other teams. You can beat some of the bad teams with a quarterback like Max Duggan, perhaps, if your team is good. So I'd spend a top of the fourth-round pick on him. You know, if you're somewhere around that 100 range or slightly after 100 after your compensatory picks, that's exactly where I see a guy like Max Duggan going, where the traits aren't there, but the skill set and what he brings to the table is still beneficial to the team compared to some of these other guys in this draft. At 8, Jaren Hall, again, another one of those backups with higher-end upside. He is a good athlete, but I think he's had too many problems with injuries to really go much higher than this. Some people are way down on him. I've seen people say he's an undrafted guy in this draft. I've seen some people say he's as high as a third-round pick. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think you spend about a fourth-rounder on him, and I think the reason you do it is because he's a decent passer. He's a good athlete. I think the biggest problem he runs into is he gets out of rhythm, and there's times, especially throwing over the middle, where he misses those intermediate passes. So he's got problems that he's going to have to work out. You spend a pick on that and say maybe he develops into a top backup, much like Max Duggan. Now, he's higher end physical trait-wise, and he's a guy that maybe can develop. Maybe he winds up being a starter in the NFL, whereas I don't think Max Duggan really is going to work his way into that spot. I think when you're talking Jaren Hall here, you take him and you hope that you're going to develop him into something, but you don't put so much into this guy that you're going to say he has any plans of being the starter in the future. You take him, you're pleasantly surprised, he turns into a starter, awesome. You spent a fourth-round pick, and you got a starting quarterback. If not, well, hopefully we have a backup quarterback with a little bit of moxie, a little bit of skill, and a little bit of things that he brings to the table that maybe is a change-up for other teams. You know, if you're used to defending a pocket passer, if you have a Derek Carr, and the Saints take Jaren Hall in the 4th round as a backup quarterback, he can be a guy that now all of a sudden the defense has to prepare. If you have Carr as questionable for the entire week and then Jaren Hall winds up starting the game, well, we have to prepare for an entirely different skill set. And I see him as a guy that can be that change of pace backup quarterback that might win you a game or two if people fall asleep on what he can do talent-wise. At 9, Stetson Bennett out of Georgia. He, again, is the oldest quarterback coming out of college football. Close behind him is Hendon Hooker. He just doesn't have the physical traits. He's small. He's old. He's a guy that has decent accuracy. But, again, you're talking about coming out of these programs like Georgia. Like I bashed on the top guys, right? I bashed on Hendon Hooker. I bashed on Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud from coming from these mega programs that have everything perfect. Georgia's offense wasn't talent-wise, necessarily one of the best. I think they had great running backs. I think they have a great offensive line. I don't think they have great receivers necessarily, but they have some good tight ends. Even if things weren't perfect for his offense, he had one of the most forgiving scenarios, having that Georgia defense out there stopping other teams from putting up tons of points. So Stetson Bennett, some people are pretty high on him. I see him as an early 5th-round pick in my book. He's a guy that, much like Max Duggan, you take him and hope he develops into that kind of backup that is much more reliable than most backup quarterbacks are in the league today, where if you need him to come in to sub for 2 to 4 games, maybe you wind up going 500 and your playoff hopes stay alive. I just don't see the top end that some people have had with Stetson Bennett. I think he's one of those guys that winds up as like a relief pitcher in the pros. And maybe he winds up being a higher-end paid backup. Maybe he's a guy like Teddy Bridgewater that always seems to find a job, and every time somebody needs a bridge quarterback, they call him up. I just don't see him as having that starting potential. Now, 10th on my list is a guy that I struggled to place a little bit, Clayton Tune out of Houston. He is 6'3", 220 pounds, and he's interesting isn't the right word for him, but he's interesting because he has a lot of passing ability. He just did it at Houston against a lot of lower-end competition. And I don't know that anything we saw out of him was enough to look at his profile and say, yeah, I need to spend anything higher than a late 5th rounder on him and expect him to be anything more than a backup quarterback. But maybe more so than those guys that I put ahead of him. Maybe more so than Duggan, maybe more so than Hall, maybe more so than Stetson Bennett. He's a guy that has some starter potential where maybe you just shoot for the moon and you take him a little bit higher than this late 5th round spot that I have and say, let's just see what we have here. It's just really hard to gamble on that when you consider the strength of the competition that he played. Now, he's an accurate passer. I think his passing ability is actually kind of underrated, but until we see that multiple jumps up from college to the pros, he's a hard guy to place. He's just much like Malik Willis last year, where you saw him get into the NFL and he just looked totally unprepared. There is a scenario where I think Clayton Tune makes that double jump up from Houston all the way to the NFL, and we look around and say, man, this guy was just not ready. It didn't really translate. He was beaten up on some bad players. That's why I don't think I'd spend a high pick on him. But I think the opportunity, it might be there, right? He's 6'3", he's 220, he's a great passer of the ball. If I told you if I told you he played at Kentucky or Georgia or Tennessee, or if I told you he played in the Big Ten, we'd be talking about this guy perhaps being a first-round pick. Instead, he went to Houston, and I think you got to pump the brakes a little bit. So I think he could be a high-end backup. Again, this is why I'd spend a draft pick on him, because he could be one of those better-end backup quarterbacks in the league. But I think maybe more than those other guys I'm more sure about, he's a guy that has some potential that maybe if everything hits, he winds up being a starter in the league. I don't see it, but the opportunity does exist. Second to last, Jake Haener out of Fresno State, 6'1", 195 pounds. Another backup here. Again, early 6th-round pick. I see him and Clayton Tune as a little bit more interchangeable guys. I don't really see them being great players, but with the way they threw the ball and the way that they executed in the passing game, I think it's worth spending a pick on them. I think somebody somewhere is going to look at it and say, I need a backup quarterback I can be sure about. Maybe I have Tua, and I know they signed Mike White this year to be their backup quarterback, but maybe I just want to be more sure about it. Maybe it's San Fran that says we can turn water into wine with our quarterback so we can find a way to get blood from stone. I think both Haener and Tune have that high-end kind of what if about them that maybe they turn into starters. I just don't think either one of those guys necessarily is a safe enough gamble to spend anything more than the late round pick, especially for a lot of teams that are trying to get better. You're just not spending a 3rd round pick on these guys. You're going to wait until the end of the draft. Maybe they wind up as undrafted free agents. Maybe they wind up being 4th, 5th, 6th round picks. I think both Haener and Tune have a little bit of that moxie to them, so there'll be interesting prospects to see where they actually wind up going and who values the backup quarterback enough to spend an actual draft pick on it. And my last quarterback that I'd consider spending a pick on in this year's draft is Aiden O'Connell out of Purdue. Now, he's 24 and a half, so he's a little bit on the older side, but he is 6'3", he's 215. He's a guy that has some of that prototypical quarterback size. I think his problem, though, is he is very much... He has some accuracy problems, and it kind of comes and goes with his passing game. I don't really know that I'd spend a huge pick on him, but he's a guy that has had enough success that if we're in the 7th round and maybe I missed on some of the other guys, maybe they went ahead of where I wanted to take them, I would consider taking Aiden O'Connell to be my backup quarterback just for the pure fact that he has had so much experience in college, and he is still, when he's in rhythm, he is a decent passer. I think the problem with him, though, is that rhythm just kind of comes and goes, and as far as everything else goes, I think the reason he winds up last on my list as the draftable quarterbacks is, for me to take him, I probably have to have struck out on those, pretty much since Max Duggan at 7. So 7 through 11, if I didn't get that guy or they didn't fall where I wanted them to be in the draft and I wanted to spend a pick on a backup quarterback because I don't necessarily trust my starter, this is where I take Aiden O'Connell. So I think there's a pretty high chance he winds up as an undrafted free agent because teams a lot of times like to take other gambles with their 7th round picks. But if you're around that spot and you need a quarterback, you can do worse than Aiden O'Connell in this one. I think you take him and you just, it's a Hail Mary. It's the ultimate shot in the dark that maybe we can teach him and coach him up into the better end of what we've seen out of him at Purdue instead of, when things go poorly for him, they go bad. So for Aiden O'Connell, he is kind of that last guy that I would consider spending a pick on. So those are the 12 quarterbacks that I can see being worth a pick in this year's draft. What'd you think about the video? Who did I get right? Who did I get wrong? Where am I high on a guy? Where am I low on a guy? Let me know in the comments. I love reading them. I read each and every one, and I want to do a video talking about where everybody kind of saw, their opinion versus mine. So let me know in the comments below, and make sure you weigh in there because, that's a huge part of why I do this. It's not just because I want to get out here and talk. I want to hear what everybody else thinks too. So make sure you do that. And if you like the video, or even if you didn't, help me out. Hit the thumbs up button down below, because that helps us so much. It tells YouTube what you saw was worth your time, and we appreciate that. As far as this draft goes, if I had to give it an overall grade, I would give it a B+. And the reason I give it a B+ is because I think there's 6 guys up at the top of the draft that have starter potential in them, and some of them have some star potential in them. Every one of these guys has something wrong with them, though. From 1 to 6, from 7 to 12, every one of these guys has some sort of drawback that you look at, and there is no Trevor Lawrence, there is no Justin Fields in this draft that you look at and you say, man, that's actually, I struggle to find faults with them. So I think this is a really strong quarterback class, and like I said, B+. The reason it stays out of A is because nobody is perfect in this group, and I think this is still one of the better quarterback classes we're going to see, and I think we're actually going to see a bunch of starters that survive in the NFL coming out of this group. So I'm excited to see that. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you saw, make sure you hit the subscribe button, because we're going to be talking about every position group going into the 2023 draft, as well as everything else NFL and sports related. So for Sports Around the Bar, I'm Jake. Thanks so much for hanging with me, and, cheers. We'll see you next time.